is with us to discuss the latest from America, what's happening. We also have Professor Fulbert Namwamba, who is joining us from Maryland. And of course, we have Joseph Simeha, who is a policy and political analyst, also joining us in studio to talk to us about what's happening in America. Joseph, let me begin with you now that I closed with Professor Namwamba. Looking at what's happening in the U.S., I was told earlier by Cindy that it's safe to go to the U.S. At this particular time in the developing nations and developing democracies, they would have issued travel advisories, right or wrong?
They would certainly have issued travel advisories. I think it's just to put what is happening in the U.S. in perspective. I do not see it as both a student and teacher of public administration and politics. I do not see it as anything new. That, to me, is the image of the United States of America. A violent society, but especially against minorities. But now, I guess, because what you saw on Capitol Hill wasn't necessarily against minorities, but against an institution that they saw as legitimizing a win of Joe Biden, which, in their opinion, had gone against the protector of that image I'm talking about. And that is the image of white supremacy and violence against minorities that come in the way of that white supremacy and white privilege.
All right. Someone said that if the opposite happened at Capitol yesterday, the results would be different. Let me speak to Cindy now. And Cindy, what happened at Capitol yesterday is said to be the last kick of a dying horse, so to say. Do you agree? All right, we don't have Cindy, but let me speak to Professor. Professor, you said it earlier that what happened at Capitol yesterday was the last kick of a dying horse. I want to talk about the 25th Amendment, but do you agree indeed it was the last kick? This was sealed long before yesterday.
So I believe in what I said. When I say the last kicks of a dying horse, is that what's happening in the U.S., there's the diverse United States that they call the melting pot. And there's the old order United States that was always led by what you would call WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So what was happening is Trump represented a certain section of the population that believed that they needed to make America white again, but they used the term great again. But in that, they feel insecure that you have immigrants and people of diverse nations coming in. The Republican Party swung rightwards, and they were hanging on to Donald Trump because he said what nobody wanted to say. Unfortunately, his time is over, and this chaos he was sponsoring yesterday was an attempt to stay in power.
And we have seen the result of those chaos. Facebook just released a statement, Professor, a while ago, indicating that they'll continue blocking him from Facebook and Instagram, the two accounts, because those two accounts have been misleading and spreading hateful messages. And of course, we know Twitter did this earlier on. How is the reception of that in the US? Because we know he has 74 million behind him.
Yes, well,
yes, can you hear me okay?
Donald Trump has been the biggest spreader of misinformation and fake news.
Many of you are saying that they're happy that this happened.
As fake news, but himself has been the godfather of fake people who have believed in him.
This may prevent
so
it's
over for them. And reality that they realize that America has come back biting again. The results in Georgia indicate to you that the majority in the United States cannot take it anymore. Now, that there being a majority, the minority, that 74 million, are quite significant, and their voices need to be heard, but their voices have to be heard within limits of civilization or civility. Not in the kind of thuggery we saw yesterday.
All right. Let's try if we can talk to Cindy once again. And Cindy, I hope now we can communicate. we know what has happened at Capitol Hill. We know what's happening today. But tell us, going forward, before we speak about the 25th Amendment, what do we expect? What is the procedure? We saw the election, now we saw the affirmation happening. But what is the next procedure to this before the 20th?
Right. Well, basically, we are waiting for the inauguration, and the mayor of Washington, D.C. says that large security perimeters will be built around the Capitol. So right now, they're bracing for the possibility of more violence.
Possibility of more violence, yet you said it's okay to come to the U.S. at this particular point. I'm still wondering possibility, but I've seen what happens in Washington. So introduce to us exactly what has been muted, what has been spoken about, because one, we are told that yesterday it's actually Mike Pence, the vice president, who called the National Guard to action. It wasn't President Trump. And yesterday, watching cable news, we realized that President Trump only made his statement after Joe Biden had made his own statement and called him out.
Yes, that's right. And many are questioning why it was Vice President Pence who actually called in the D.C. National Guard and why it took so long. We had the Virginia governor, who is a Democrat, sending in the National Guard, and the Republican governor, who is of Maryland, a neighboring state, sending in their National Guard. And so there's a lot of questions about if President Trump was reluctant to send in the National Guard, and if he perhaps was okay with what was going on inside the Capitol, where we even had Vice President Pence hiding and sheltering, and lawmakers under their desk and fearing for their lives.
That act alone now perhaps lends credence to the fact that a lot is being said about the 25th Amendment, that perhaps he was scared. That's why he agreed that the inauguration on the 20th will go on.
Yes, we did get a statement from one of the president's communications people saying we still think that the election was rigged, but that the peaceful transfer of power will happen. And I'm hearing now that President Trump is expected to go to a nearby mountain retreat, Camp David, this weekend. So everyone is a little bit nervous, and we're just getting word that the Transportation Secretary, Elaine Chao, is resigning, a first cabinet member to resign after what happened. So we've also had a number of other officials who have resigned.
Cindy, I'm coming back to you. Simeha, did this act, what happened in the U.S., straight after the election, has it exposed the kind of fragile democracy we have in the United States?
It does expose not just democracy in the United States, but it does expose everything that the United States stands for. In my opinion, you know, what has happened in the United States, what has come to the foreground, is not something that has been bred over the last 4 or so years of Donald Trump's administration or his being in power. I think that, for as far back as the history of the United States goes, is what the United States has been. But the United States has been so good, so good on the international stage at dominating the mass media, dominating control over information, dominating the tools of social conditioning, that we get an impression that it's such a great democracy where everything works.
Okay.
But now it's, you know, these cracks are occurring because of what Professor there said earlier, that you get people who get so emboldened in that society that this privilege, they see it as a right. It becomes a right that they want to speak about, assert that right, and go for it.
Okay.
And this is when we begin to see those cracks you know, come through. And thank God for the proliferation of the tools of mass media. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been seeing this live, you know, following it in real time.
All right, this is simplistic, Joseph, but I want to know, do they lose their legitimacy to, quote-unquote, lecture developing nations and emerging democracies?
Again, I just think, you know, I mean, this is for me very personal. They have never, ever had that legitimacy, but because they have the tools of domination, commercial, economic tools of domination, military tools of domination, information tools of domination, because they have all diplomatic tools of domination on the international stage, because they have all these tools of domination, it always, unfortunately, happens that what they say is what is taken as the right thing. the civil thing to do, the ethical thing to do. But they really have never had a right to lecture us, and I'm hoping on democracy and so on, and I'm hoping that now this has happened and has been exposed the way it has been, that we, the rest of humanity, can challenge this, can rightly challenge this and not step back, even a bit, so that, we can relate as equal human beings in terms of human dignity. I know that we're not equal in everything else, but in terms of human dignity, so that we can navigate and negotiate our interests as equal human beings, and that they don't abuse this domination they have over the rest of the world.
Professor Namwamba, Barack Obama was here about 6 years ago, and he spoke about democracy and leaders in developing nations trying to hold on to power. And I know it's even wrong to put President Barack Obama and President Trump on the same pedestal, but looking at the two presidents and how the transitions happened and now what's happening in the U.S., do you draw any parallels? Do we accuse an individual, or do we talk about the fragile democracy that is the U.S. and that has been exposed by this single act of Porter's 45?
First of all, let me commend my colleague Simeha for being spot on the money. While I commend my colleague Simeha, I would like to say there is impression and there is reality. And the impression comes in from a question a young black man asked Donald Trump during the campaign. He said, "You want to make America great again. Mr. President, when was America great for black people?" When I say when was America great for black people, if the people yesterday, the protesters yesterday were Black Lives Matter, we would have had a big massacre and would be having deaths today. So the United States has always had double standards, and the United States has never been a perfect union. It always said towards a perfect union. If the US was a perfect union, it should never have had slavery. It would never have had subjugation of women's rights. All these rights have been acquired after riots, after demonstrations, and those demonstrations are not new in the US. Anybody who thinks that these are the first demonstrations in the US, they've got it simply wrong. The only thing about the US is that it's got solid traditions of resolving its contradictions. The contradictions are there, but there are mechanisms of resolving those contradictions. The last 4 years, minorities have realized that if they didn't go to vote, they are going to be subjugated. And so they came out and voted in a big way, and they put their conditions. Having saved the Joe Biden primary, they told him, you need to have one of ours as the vice president. We are no longer going to just be the escorters of the Democrat Party. We want to be in on top of the game. And those are the things you are seeing, that what the white supremacists who broke into the Congress yesterday demonstrated is also the white supremacists are not very happy because Trump was their last hope for holding on to dominant power. So the US is a reality. And about the US lecturing other countries, I want us to be careful here. Yes, it's not, it may be hypocritical for the US to lecture other countries, but I caution my brother Simeha, that does not mean that we should not fight for democracy in Kenya. That does not mean we should not fight for equal opportunities in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. That does not mean we must not fight for freedoms. When we fight for these freedoms in developing nations, yes, we may say we want to be like the US, and we may point out that the US is not perfect, but that does not take away the fact that Africans must fight to have justice, must have freedoms. Whether or not the US is perfect or not, we need also to stay focused to have those freedoms for our people.
And of course, it's been years of tradition. Cindy, talk to me. Trump, at this particular point, cut a figure of a very lonely man. We had reports that the inner circle was disintegrating. If he didn't take this move, after what Pence did, the inner circle, it was imminent that the inner circle was going to collapse. Is this true? Do we have reports of anyone who's left the inner circle?
Well, we are getting some indications of that may be true. with very close, one of his wife Melania's closest aides resigning. Now with the former Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney, who is the Special Envoy to Northern Ireland, resigning. So it does look like, and like I say, what we're watching closely is there appears now to be a break between the president and the vice president. And so we are wondering if the vice president will heed calls for him to take action. We've not heard from him so far today. He's not been on Twitter or anything since early in the morning hours, certifying that Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States.
And of course, he's supposed to be at the White House today. Let's see how that unfolds. But tell me, there's no Congress committee. And of course, it's only the cabinet that can pull such a move as invoking the 25th Amendment, because right now the Congress is just constituting and all that. What happened? Why was this necessary? Why is it necessary that we can even have this discussion when Donald Trump has only 13 days on the clock?
Well, you're right, and some would say that it's not necessary, and that we should just wait for the inauguration. The president has said that there will be a peaceful transfer of power, so we'll just have to see what happens. Others say that the president bears some responsibility for the violence that happened, because he called on his supporters to come to D.C. and he spoke to them at the rally and encouraged them to go to the Capitol. So the FBI is investigating now the violence that happened, and right now today I would say we have more questions than answers.
The major source of information for the journalists like you and I from President Trump and the White House, especially information that is eye-opening, is his Twitter account that he mostly used over the last 4 years. Where inherently do you get the information apart from the statements that are coming out at this particular point?
Yes, that's right. And we're just getting, there are a few people who are very close to members of his inner circle that we're hearing. And I have to say, I don't have independent confirmation, but we're hearing that President was very upset at Vice President Pence yesterday, saying that he betrayed me. But you're right, we don't have the direct, we have not been hearing from the president directly, and we don't have his tweets right now. So it's an interesting, once again, we're saying this is uncharted territory.
Okay. Titanic of Germany gave him an opportunity to post the tweets on their website or on their Twitter handle, and we've seen quite some communication from Titanic. Is this also regarded as reliable? Do we still regard them as tweets from Porter's 45?
I am really not sure about that. I wasn't aware of that development, and I know that some are also encouraging for him to go on Parler and others. And okay. I know that YouTube is now saying that they are going to not post any new calls for violence or anything that could be associated with right-wing and white supremacist groups. All right. So there's a lot of things in flux.
All right, just take a look at it. Titanic has even the face of Donald Trump on their handle. Thanks very much, Cindy Sain from The Voice of America. We're going to release you now, but let me speak to Joseph now. Joseph, listening to what's happening in America, and I know we've tried to draw the parallels and we're trying to draw the lessons. This was imminent. They saw it coming. Did he see it coming?
I guess he... And by the way, he could try one of those Chinese apps. There are many Chinese apps.
To use in sending out messages?
Yes, so that, yeah. I think it will be such a beautiful irony. I doubt that he saw this coming. I mean, in terms of that...
Until the last minute, until Pence went to Congress.
Because from what has been coming from his mouth, through the mass media, through especially social media, and so on, he has sounded so confident in terms of his and his mob's ability to stop what the American people have decided in terms of who their next president is. He has seemed to believe that he's invincible and what he represents is invincible and that he will stop this. I mean, I hope you saw the tweets I think he sent out on 29th talking about the riot, actually, of 6th, that is yesterday's, on Capitol Hill. He talked about it on 29th and said how wild it's going to be and so on. So yes, I think he didn't see it coming, but I suppose the American nation saw it coming. Because it's not anything new. He's spoken about this openly. When I see on news media outlets people saying that the security services on Capitol Hill were overwhelmed, I sort of disagree. I sort of think that they...
That's a fortified. I've been to that place.
I think I think they just gave in. I think they played along.
Yes.
I think it is something they aided for it to happen. As Professor there was saying, you know, if it was a black, you know, Lives Matter, for example, demonstration attempting to breach Capitol, I think it would have been something completely different.
Okay.
And I think that is the perspective I keep insisting that we need to place what we are seeing in. That's the context, you know, the double standards, the discrimination, the violent white supremacist society that America also represents, besides what many other positive things that the U.S. actually represents. I'm not in any way suggesting that that's the only thing the U.S. represents, because no one society has just one story. But this is a story that they've always suppressed, but has reared its ugly head. I don't think it's going away anytime soon. I agree with Professor Namwamba, by the way, that yes, we must, in our countries, continue to fight. But I refuse that we should be patronized by people like, you know, the American establishment, that they're the ones who represent standards in terms of value systems. Because we can build our own democracy on the basis of an African value system or African value systems, which they have rubbished as negative, as retrogressive, you know, as not something that we should aspire to, because they want us to aspire to their value system. So I think those are parallels we have to keep drawing and see what lessons do we learn when we are building and strengthening our own democracies with the challenges we have of fighting autocracies that we have also in this country and on this continent.
White supremacy, white privilege, we also play out a different story. Professor, let me bring you in to the tail end of our conversation. We are really interested to know how Article 25 would work out. Would you be kind enough to explain to us how would it work?
Article 25 was made in the event that, say, suppose a president is sick, suppose a president has lost his mind, suppose a president has lost control. Under such circumstances, they had to put in a mechanism whereby a president cannot stick in office and refuse to go. It comes in first, there was an incident, the second president of the United States who refused to leave office. And when he refused to leave office, the office left him. On Swahili discussion lists, I've talked about President Trump akikataa kutoka atakatiwa stima na maji. So my term when I say kukatiwa stima na maji is that the country was shaken. A whole vice president of the United States, who is the second in command, a speaker who is third in command, and the whole US Congress being overrun by mobs. And they are being overrun in mobs due to lapses in security because the president of the country has refused to do what is right. That was a serious consideration. And without any other information, I believe that the reason that Trump conceded last night is that they are behind the scenes, they were making plans of easing him out of office. And he realized he doesn't want to live in to live in a bad situation, so he preferred to hang in and get some dignity of some sort. But I wouldn't lie to you that that has been one of the worst presidents that this country has had. People have suffered. Black people have hurt. Minorities have hurt. Muslims have hurt. Women have hurt. And lying to ourselves that it's been perfect is not the right thing. The thing is, you cannot stop a train. The train has left the station. Joe Biden is headed to be our next president. Kamala Harris is headed to be our next vice president. There are good things ahead. Mambo iko mbele iko sawa sawa.
Even as we speak about even as we speak about white supremacy and the white privilege and the Black Lives Matter, there's a book right behind you. Is it a book? It talks about tribal leadership. What is that book about?
Tribal leadership is where us in Kenya will talk of the Luya tribe, the Kikuyu tribe, the Maragoli. In reality, US is divided in tribes. They are not called tribes. They could be called white supremacists. They'd be called black nationalists. We can call the Native American activists. Leadership that is drawn may not be necessarily ethnicity or language, but the point is that you are a village hero within a certain group. Tribal means it's not universal.
Okay.
And it's good to understand how the concept of what they would call tribal leadership in the US, because there's a lot of parallels with what you call the tribal heroes, even back in Africa. The king of the Kalenjins, the king of the Luyas, the spokesman of the Luos, things, those terminologies of that kind. That's what we call tribal leadership.
Okay.
And yes, I welcome you to read it someday.
All right, definitely, definitely. Joseph, let me bring you in. It's a tradition. We have spoken quite a lot about the tradition of America. Most of these things are grounded in tradition. What should ideally have happened or should happen? And we saw what Pence did, in spite of the fact that he's the VP. We saw what he did. But I want to take you back to after the election. One of the tradition is the incumbent president will always invite the incoming president to White House, give a tour, afford their teams, both teams, an opportunity to work together. That did not happen. With 13 days on the clock, Joseph, is this likely to happen? Are we likely to see President Trump now invite Biden and his team to the other side to introduce them, perhaps whatever the formality is?
Yes, I think those are courtesies, a tradition of courtesies for the outgoing president to, and the first lady to welcome the incoming team and also the vice president. Those are a tradition of courtesies. But where I think America has got, where Trump has got, if I was in the position of the incoming president, I wouldn't even want that. I think what is most important beyond the courtesies, the personal good manners, if I may call that, is the fact of working institutions. I think, as I said, America, like any other society, has many stories. It doesn't just have negative or positive only stories. And one of the positive stories is the stories of institutions that institutions that work. Yes, individuals in top offices oftentimes undermine those institutions, but they still work. They are strong institutions. They have a long history and tradition of building these institutions that work in a particular way. So, for example, institutions that are charged with the responsibility of managing a transition, even though Donald Trump and Company Limited have done what they could do to undermine those very institutions, I believe they are still going to work for the United States. They are still going to ensure that there is a transition. Just like you've seen, I'm sure, Ken, that the multiple layers, the multiple institutions of accountability for a presidential election, they have worked. There is no fear that this institution is headed by a Republican or a Democrat or from whatever party. The fear that paralyzes us in this country, Kenya, that if we say that we are going to have political parties, for example, nominate commissioners to the Electoral Commission, that only can make us fight.
They actually work for the institutions. They don't work for individuals.
They don't work for individuals, neither do they work for their parties.
Yes.
Because they have developed a tradition of that public service. Public service, again, as a broader institution, that you develop that culture with its values so that you are not afraid to identify yourself as a member of ODM or a member of PNU or a member of Jubilee and so on, because when you are given a public service responsibility, you have to make your best to abide by the value system that guides the public service. I'm not saying that it removes all the biases, but overall, for me, that is one of the positive stories from the US, the tradition and culture of institutions, public institutions that work.
And it boils down to the least in such institutions and the best. For example, it's unimagined that in Nairobi, in Kenya, if the president would decline to leave office, the handlers will actually force him out. Wakati stima na wakati. It's unimagined.
Yeah, it's unimaginable.
Can I say something?
Go ahead, Professor.
Yes, I would like to urge my brother Smeha to see if we can get away from using the term America this, America that. What I'm saying is that within America, there are various levels, and various views. I personally did when people tell me, you people this, you Americans that, and I tell them, within America, there's diversity in ideas, just as in Kenya. The fact that there is a cattle rustling in West Pokot does not make all Kenyan cattle rustlers. The fact that there is an issue in Nairobi City does not mean in Nakuru there is also dysfunction. In the same way, what we've seen has happened in the US. I agree that the US is not perfect. I agreed with my brother. But when you say America should not lecture us, no, it's that particular government. For example, what the Obama government will lecture you will not be the same as what the Trump government will lecture you, will not be the same as what the Bush government will lecture you. Then the perception that America is perfect, that perception is not in America. Actually, that perception is in Kenya, Africa, Europe. It's not in the US. We do know that the US is not perfect. Particularly African Americans do know that they've had to fight tooth and nail, despite what Americans keep saying their system is the best. All Americans know that the electoral college system is not the best. If you had a simple majority, Joe Biden would be president. But because they are stuck with the tradition, they know that the electoral college is not perfect. And America does have imperfections. If you accept it as such, I think we are talking the same voice that, yes, the U.S., don't ever look at the U.S. as a monolith. View it as having some diversity in between.
Noted, Professor. And finally, we have about 2 minutes on the clock, and I'd like to give you a minute each. What Trump's statement made clear was there will be a smooth transfer of power on the 20th. Joseph, smooth transfer of power, does it include Trump attending the inauguration?
Well, maybe not, and I think that's an example, another example of what I'm referring to. Professor may have missed when I said that America has many stories. So when I say that, I mean diversity. Some things work, some things don't work. So, and I mentioned examples of things that work. And the institutions that are responsible for transition and the tradition of transition from one president to another in the history of the United States, I think is an example of what has been set to happen in spite of what the outgoing or incoming president thinks. So it doesn't matter what Trump said. I think that statement is not really valuable. Whether he says that or not, it's going to happen, at least based on the tradition of the United States and the institutions that facilitate transition. The transition is going to happen.
All right, and finally, Professor Namwamba, he said there will be a smooth transition of power on the 20th. We know he has very deep feelings about what's happening. He said it's the end of the first term of one of the best presidencies in American history, but the beginning of his struggle or fight for electoral justice. So when he mentions again that there will be a smooth transfer, does that include him being at the inauguration?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. He can do himself a favor for his legacy by being there, or he can do himself a disfavor by not being there. Whether he's there or not, the transfer is smooth because, as Semeha has said, the institutions are very strong. And the institutions are so strong, on the day before, they'll take all his personal things and put them in a U-Haul truck.
Really?
His Secret Service bodyguards will be withdrawn and he'll remain with only 2 to 4 bodyguards. His official communications will be cut. Even if he remained in the White House, he'd have no way of communicating. And then all loyalty of all government departments and military chiefs will all automatically transfer to Joe Biden. The Secret Service will automatically transfer to Joe Biden. He has no choice. He has no choice but to cooperate. And if he doesn't cooperate, the country will move on smoothly. The transition will be smooth. Despite those little traditions, he does not have a choice.
All right. thank you very much from the free world. Indeed, Trump today, at least for the first time since the election, made it clear that his term has ended of 4 years. Thank you very much, Professor Fulbert Namwamba from Maryland, for sharing your perspective. We look forward to talking to you even on the day of the inauguration. Earlier we had Cindy Sain from the Voice of America, correspondent there, and of course my friend Joseph Simeha, policy and political analyst, coming to studio to talk to us. And thank you, Damien Evans, sign language interpreter tonight. Thank you for watching. Our regular program resumes, but we'll be right here the following day to inform you of what's happening in and around you, and of course out in the other parts of the world. Have a good night and God bless.